A little girl tells a lonely mail-order bride left at a snowy station that she needs a home and they need a mommy. And that's how a super sweet family adventure begins in the Wild West. That's the hook that'll warm your heart, pal. Let's hop in. "You need a home and I need a mommy," said the little girl to the mail-order bride left at the station. Dakota Territory, winter of 1887. Snow swept in from the north like a living thing, swirling and clawing at the wind-battered rail station. The air bit through wool, the platform board slick with ice. The train that had carried Linda Whitford across half the country gave one last shrill whistle before vanishing into the white horizon. She stepped down from the last carriage, carpet bag in hand, her other gloved, hand gripping her hat brim against the wind. The neat, dark green coat she had left the East in was dulled from travel, its hems stiff with frost. She searched for a familiar face, a sign, anything, but saw only strangers hurrying away, heads bent, to the weather. From the doorway of the station office, the ticket clerk called, his breath clouding. "You waiting on someone?" "Yes," Linda said, her voice rough. "A man named Walter Briggs. He was supposed to meet me." "Ain't seen him?" the clerk replied. "If no one's here to fetch you, best find shelter quick. We don't keep folks overnight, too. Cold, too risky. Hotel's full. Boarding house might be too." Linda's stomach nodded. He promised. Promises don't stop frostbite. The clerk cut in. Two cowhands stomped past, climbing into a wagon without a glance at her. The platform emptied until only the wind and the groan of the swinging sign remained. Snow was already clinging to her skirt, and dusk crept closer. Then, from the far end, two small figures appeared, a girl tugging along a younger boy. Their cheeks were raw from the wind, their steps uneven in the snow. The girl's braid was loose, her hands bare. They stopped in front of Linda. The girl lifted her chin. "You need a home," she said matter-of-factly, "and we don't have a mama anymore." The boy, no more than 5, clung to her sleeve, peeking at Linda with wide brown eyes. His coat was missing buttons, one boot bound with twine. "Where are your parents?" Linda asked. "Our paw's name is Elias Monroe," the girl announced. "He's got a farm past the cottonwoods. He's looking for a wife, but he's busy today." Linda frowned. "I don't know him. You will if you come with us. He won't say no. We've been waiting for a lady." "You'll do." Linda hesitated. "I came here to meet someone else." The girl crossed her arms. "Well, he isn't here, is he? Paw's just not at the station. We're here to fetch you." The boy's voice was small. "It's real cold, miss. Our house has a fire." Linda glanced at their thin coats, their red ears. "Where is your house?" "Not far," the girl said. "Past the big fence, through the cottonwoods. We walk it all the time." She held out a bare hand. "Come on. If you stand here much longer, you'll turn to ice." The clerk stepped out again. "Best decide, ma'am. Sun will be down in an hour." Linda stared at the chapped fingers offered to her. She could stay, risk the cold and the night in a strange town, or follow 2 children to a man she'd never met. She thought of the long miles behind her, of being left with no welcome, and the way the boy's teeth chattered as he tried to smile. Slowly, she shifted her carpet bag and placed her gloved hand into the girl's. "Show me the way," the girl grinned. "I'm Annie. This is my brother, Tommy." "Linda Whitford," she said. "Linda," Annie repeated thoughtfully. "P will like that name." They led her off the platform, their small boots crunching through fresh snow. The wind tugged at Linda's coat, but ahead a thin ribbon of smoke rose into the gray sky. She tightened her shawl and stepped into their tracks, whatever lay at the end. Of that snowy road, it was better than being left behind. The path from the station wound through stands of cottonwood trees heavy with snow, then opened onto a narrow lane marked by a leaning fence. The boards were gray with age, patched in places, with rope. Beyond it sat a low, weathered house with smoke curling from its stone chimney. The front porch sagged slightly at one end, and the roof bore the dull sheen of frost that never melted in the heart of winter. Annie pushed the door open without knocking. A wave of heat met Linda as she stepped inside, the sharp sting of cold air on her face, replaced by a welcome warmth. The scent of wood smoke hung in the room, mingled with the yeasty aroma of fresh bread. A cast-iron stove glowed red in the corner, the orange light flickering against the rough honeyed walls. Linda hesitated just past the threshold, stamping snow from her boots. The room was modest, a long table worn smooth by years of use, shelves lined with crockery and jars, a braided rug, curled slightly at the edges. By the stove sat a round loaf of bread on a cooling board, its crust dark and crackled. The sound of boots on packed snow drew her gaze toward the doorway at the far side of the room. A man stepped in, brushing frost from his shoulders. He was tall, broad in the chest and shoulders. His shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms despite the cold. His hair was dark, cut short, and a thin scar traced the edge of his brow. His eyes, gray and steady, moved over her once, not lingering, not hurried, before settling into an unreadable calm. Annie and Tommy brightened at his arrival. "Pa, we brought her," Annie said, as if announcing the delivery of an important parcel. Linda straightened, her carpet bag still in hand. The man, alias Monroe, took in the sight of her with no visible surprise. He did not ask her name, nor how she came to be in his house. Instead, he nodded toward a chair near the stove. "Sit," he said, his voice was low. "Eat." Linda glanced to the children, who were now perched together on the rug before the fire, whispering behind their hands and stealing looks at her. She crossed the room and set her bag beside the chair. Elias moved to the counter, ladled a generous portion of soup from a pot into a thick ceramic bowl, and placed it on the table in front of her. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of onions, carrots, and slow-cooked meat. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave a small incline of his head, but said nothing more. The only sounds were the hiss of the stove and the muffled giggles of Annie and Tommy as they watched their father's face for any sign of reaction. Linda took a tentative spoonful. The soup was hearty and warm, and the heat spread through her chest in a way that felt almost like safety. She had not realized how hungry she was until that first taste. Elias stepped to a workbench near the far wall where a block of wood and a carving knife waited. Without looking at her again, he picked up the knife and resumed shaping the piece, his movements measured and precise. The children crept closer to watch him work, the earlier excitement fading into a quiet routine that seemed well-worn in this house. Linda ate in silence, her eyes wandering over the small details of the room, the patch in the rug stitched with thread that did not quite match, the row of tin mugs hanging from hooks above the counter, the heavy boots drying near the door. Everything here spoke of a life built on necessity and care without excess. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully, unsure whether to speak or simply rise and leave. Elias had not asked about the man she had been meant to meet, nor how she had come to be led here by his children. His lack of questions was not unkind. It felt, instead, like an unspoken agreement that some truths could wait. The children began whispering again, glancing between her and their father. Elias only continued his carving, the shavings curling away from the blade and scattering across the workbench like pale ribbons. Linda sat back, the warmth of the fire seeping into her bones. It struck her. Then this was not the welcome of a man seeking a bride, not the start of a courtship. This was the quiet allowance of a man who saw a stranger in need of warmth and offered a place by his fire. It was not a promise, only permission to stay. And for now, in the heart of a Dakota winter, that was enough. The mornings began in silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the stove and the muffled patter of the children's feet across the wooden floor. Linda rose, early, sweeping the ashes from the hearth and folding the wool blankets neatly at the foot of the children's bed. Annie and Tommy were quick to join her in the kitchen, their hair tousled from sleep, eyes bright with curiosity. She mended shirts, with careful stitches, patched the knees of trousers worn thin from climbing fences, and darned socks by the light of the window. The work was simple, but her hands had not been idle in years, and there was comfort in the rhythm of needle and thread. Annie sat close while Linda sewed, asking about letters and words. Soon Tommy joined, and the three of them leaned over the small kitchen table in the afternoons, practicing with a blunt pencil on scraps of brown paper. Annie's letters were bold and crooked, Tommy's tiny and hesitant. Linda praised them both, patient with every smudge. Elias said little during these lessons. Most mornings he was already outside before the sun had cleared the horizon, tending to livestock or splitting wood. Yet each day, without a word, there was a tin cup of coffee set, at her place by the table. When she came in from the children's room, she noticed other small things. The split in the heel of her boot stitched neatly one evening without her asking. A thick wool scarf, faded but warm, hung on the peg nearest her chair. The scent of pine clung to it as if it had been stored away, for years until someone thought she might need it. The children began calling her Miss Linda, a title that felt both formal and dear. They were eager to show her the little wooden animals Alas carved in the evenings, tiny horses with smooth, rounded edges, a bear with one ear slightly shorter than the other, a bird poised as if ready to fly. Linda kept the pieces in a small row, on the windowsill above the table, where the pale winter light touched them each morning. They made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a place with corners that belonged to her. Still, when she ventured outside with Annie and Tommy, walking the fence line or hauling water from the pump, she began to notice the way neighbors watched. A ranch hand riding by would slow his horse, eyes lingering a little too long. A woman passing in a wagon would glance once, then again, as though trying to place her face. The first time it happened, Linda told herself it was nothing. But soon she realized the looks were not simple curiosity. There was a weight to them, a silent question she could not yet answer. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the laughter of the children shielded her from it. She let herself believe, if only in those moments, that she was not an outsider, that perhaps she had stepped into a life that could make room for her. But the wind carried, whispers in this country, and she could feel them moving closer. The trip into town was quiet. Linda sat beside Elas in the wagon, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the cold air pinching her cheeks. The children had stayed at home with the neighbor, leaving only the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creak of the harness to fill the silence. The general store was warm inside, its stove roaring in the corner, and the scent of ground coffee mingling with the sharp tang of kerosene from the lamps. Shelves were stocked with bolts of cloth, tins of biscuits, and barrels of flour. Elas moved down the narrow aisle with purpose, selecting seed packets and measuring out nails into a paper sack. Linda lingered by the counter waiting while Mrs. Harrow, tall, sharp-eyed, and wrapped in a shawl of deep maroon, counted coins for another customer. When the woman finally turned, her attention to Elias, her smile was thin and knowing. "Well, well," Mrs. Harrow said, her voice carrying easily through the room. That was quick, was it not? Living under a man's roof without a wedding ring to speak of, the words hit Linda like a slap, the warmth of the stove suddenly too close, too bright. A man by the window stopped sorting through his mail, and a pair of ranch hands near the barrels of oats paused mid-conversation. Elias said nothing. He kept his gaze on the sack of seed in his hands, his expression unreadable. Linda felt every eye in the store on her. She forced her voice steady. "We came for supplies," she said quietly, though she was unsure if anyone but herself heard the words. Mrs. Tarrow arched a brow, clearly pleased with the attention her remark had gathered. "Supplies for a household, I expect. Must be nice to settle in so quickly." Elias reached for a sack of flour, set it on the counter, and slid coins across the worn wood. His silence felt heavier than the stares. Without meeting Linda's eyes, he gathered the parcels and nodded toward the door. The ride home was wordless. Snow flurries drifted in from the west, settling on the brim of Elias's hat and the folds of Linda's skirt. She stared at the road ahead, her hands clenched beneath her cloak, the sting of Mrs. Harrow's words still fresh. When they reached the house, Elias carried the supplies inside while Linda hung her cloak by the door. The children returned soon after, their chatter filling the room. But Linda found her mind fixed on the store on the way Elias had let the moment pass without a single word in her defense. That night, after the children were asleep, Linda stood by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. Elias was at the table repairing a broken hinge. The scrape of metal on metal was the only sound. Finally she spoke. "Silence can wound as much as words, you know." Elias set down the hinge and looked at her. His gray eyes were steady, not sharp, but they gave nothing away. "I do not let other people's talk decide who stays in my home," he said simply. It was not an apology, not a promise either. But there was a weight in his voice, as if he had long since chosen which battles were worth his breath. Linda turned back to the fire, letting the heat touch her face. She did not know if she felt comforted or more alone than before. By the time spring's first winds arrived, the snow had softened into mud, the air damp and restless. Annie had been at the small schoolhouse for weeks now, walking there with two neighbor children, while Tommy stayed home with Linda. One afternoon, Linda was mending a tear in one of Elias's shirts when a sharp knock sounded at the door, too quick to be a neighbor. A boy from the schoolhouse stood there, eyes wide, holding a folded note. "From Mr. Callum," he said before hurrying off. Linda opened it. "Mrs. Whitford, please ask Mr. Monroe to speak with me tomorrow regarding an incident with Annie." Her stomach tightened. When Elias came in from the barn, she handed him the note. He read it without a change in expression. "I'll go first thing," he said. "Do you know what happened?" "No, but I'll find out." The next day, he returned later than usual, Annie trailing behind with a wrinkled dress and half-undone braid. She slipped into a room without a word. "She got into a fight," Elias said flatly, hanging up his hat. "A fight with a boy in her class." She bloodied his lip. "His father wants her kept home for a week." "Wait, what?" Elias's jaw tightened. He said, "You're just someone here to keep my bed warm. Annie told him to take it back. He didn't. She made him." The words hit hard. Linda stared at her hands. She shouldn't have done that. "No," Elias agreed, "but she was. Defending you." "I'm the reason she's in trouble," Linda murmured. "I'm giving them things to say about this family." Elias didn't answer, just crossed to the sink and began washing his hands, his broad shoulders blocking the light. That evening, Annie stayed in her room, and Tommy sat close to Linda without speaking. The silence made every creak of the cabin sound louder. After the children were asleep, Linda sat on her cot, eyes on the carpet bag she had never fully unpacked. Elias's silence in town, the way neighbors looked at her, and now Annie's trouble. She could end it by leaving. No more whispers, no more fights. He pulled the bag from under the bed, folding her. Few dresses, the fabric cold in her hands. She had just gathered her shawl when a flicker of light through the window caught her eye. Curious, she stepped quietly into the main room and opened the door. The night air was sharp. Elias sat on the top step, a lantern at his side, Tommy's red scarf in his hands. The frayed edge lay across his knee as he pushed a needle through the wool with careful, steady movements. Linda paused in the doorway, watching the way his shoulders leaned forward, the way he adjusted the thread before each stitch. No one was there to see him work. Yet he treated the mending as if it were as important as the day's harvest. He could have handed the scarf to her. She'd mended nearly everything since arriving. But he hadn't. This was his task tonight, his care. Tommy would wake to find the scarf, whole again, never knowing the time it had taken. Linda's grip on her shawl loosened. The thought of leaving slipped back into shadow. This was what bound them together, not vows or papers, but quiet acts of keeping each other whole. She stepped back, inside, closing the door softly. The warmth of the stove met her as she set the carpet bag aside, untouched. The morning began in stillness. Snow had fallen through the night, leaving the yard smooth and white under a pale sky. By midday, the clouds had returned, low, heavy, and rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, whistling through the cottonwoods beyond the fence. Inside, Linda sat with Annie at the table, sorting buttons into an old tin. Elias was outside fixing the barn door hinge, his hat pulled low against the gusts. By late afternoon, the storm was on them, snow driving sideways, rattling shutters howling down the chimney. Elias came in, brushing ice from his coat. "Stay in," he told Linda. "I'll check the animals." Minutes later, he returned, stamping snow from his boots. Annie looked up, suddenly frowning. "Where's Tommy?" Elias glanced toward the bedroom, then back to her. "I thought he was with you." The girl shook her head. "He went outside to find something, said he dropped it." Linda's stomach tightened. "What was it?" Annie hesitated. "The little horse you made him." Elias moved toward the door, but Linda was already pulling. "Her cloak from the peg. The wind's too strong," he said. "If he's frightened, he needs to hear me," she replied. "He knows my voice." They locked eyes a long moment, the storm pressing against the walls. Then Elias lit a lantern and handed it to her. "Check near the split cedar tree. That's where they play." The wind hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside, stealing her breath. Snow stung her cheeks and clung to her lashes. She bent her head and followed the faint boot prints cutting through the drifts, the lantern's light swaying with each step. Past the barn, across the open yard, the trail wound toward the cottonwoods. She called his name, but the gale swallowed her voice. Snow was already filling the tracks. At the split cedar, its trunk twisted like rope. She scanned the whiteness beyond. Near the half-frozen creek, a dark shape crouched behind a boulder. "Tommy!" she shouted, forcing her way forward. He looked up, pale and wide-eyed, clutching the wooden horse in bare hands. "I found it," he said, voice trembling. "But then I couldn't see the house anymore." Linda knelt, setting the lantern in the snow. She unfastened her cloak and wrapped it around him, pulling him close. His small body shook from the cold. "You're safe now," she said, steady though her pulse raced. "We're going home." She lifted him into her arms. He was light, but the wind fought her every step. Snow lashed her face, the ground shifting underfoot. She began to hum, then sing, an old hymn her mother used to soothe her in storms. The tune was thin against the gale. But Tommy's arms tightened around her neck. Step by step, she retraced the path, the lantern bobbing ahead of them. Her legs burned, breath coming in sharp bursts. The wind shoved and pulled, but she pushed on. The house emerged at last, its windows glowing faintly through the snow. The door opened before she reached the porch. Elias stepped out, striding across the yard to take Tommy from her arms, shielding him from the wind. Inside, the heat from the stove wrapped around them. Annie rushed forward, relief flooding her face. Linda leaned against the doorframe, her legs trembling. Elias set Tommy on the bench by the fire, stripping away wet boots and socks, rubbing his feet, briskly with a towel. Then he turned to Linda. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes were not only steady, they were open, holding something deep and unguarded. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for bringing my boy back." Linda felt the ache in her arms, the cold still on her skin and beneath it, a warmth that surprised her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She managed a small nod. Words would not be enough. Annie pressed the wooden horse into Tommy's hands. He smiled faintly, clutching it again. Linda's cloak lay damp over the chair, but she let it be. The storm roared outside, yet in the glow of the fire, they were together and safe. The afternoon sky had turned the color of wet slate, light, flat, and cold against the bare birch trees along the property. Linda folded a sheet from the clothesline as the wind snapped at the rest. Her fingers were numb despite wool gloves. Then she heard it, distant hoof-beats growing sharper. 4. Riders appeared from the bend, their mounts flinging mud and slush. The lead rider sat tall, his expression a mix of arrogance and threat. Arland Pike. His name was known in town. Land disputes, intimidation, debts collected with muscle. His presence felt like a cold draft under the door. The riders slowed as they entered the yard, mud splattering the fence like old wounds. Harlan's eyes swept the house, then fixed on her. "Well now," he said with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Seems the talk is true. Living like a wife without a ring to speak of, raising another man's children and not a scrap of paper to keep your name from the wind." Linda straightened, the folded sheet still in her arms. "I don't need paper to know where I belong." One of the men chuckled, and Harlan's smirk deepened. "Belong? Folks without roots get carried off sooner or later, and the wind, Miss Whitford, is stronger than you think." From the corner of her vision, Linda saw movement by the barn. Elias stepped into view, splitting axe in hand, his eyes pale as river ice, locked on Harlan. "Harlan," he said evenly, "if you came to talk about the south boundary, say it. If you came to insult someone in my house, turn your horse and go." Harlan sat back in his saddle. "Boundaries can wait. This is about the town. They don't like irregular arrangements. A man living with a widow, children calling her ma. It makes people wonder, and when they wonder, the court listens. The South Lot claim could be revisited. All it takes is the right voices." The man behind him chuckled again, low and damp. Linda stepped off the porch, boots crunching in the snow-crusted mud, until she stood close enough to see his breath. "In the cold. Do you think a paper makes me more fit to care for those children? I've gone into a blizzard to bring them home. I've mended their clothes, fed them, taught them while you've done what? Counted coin and spread poison." The yard went quiet, but for the wind rattling the branches. Harlan's smile thinned. "Reputation. Is everything here, and you haven't got one?" "Reputation doesn't save a lost boy in a snowstorm," Linda said. "It doesn't light a fire on a cold night. Yours keeps people bowing their heads, but I am not one of them." Something flickered in his eyes. He shifted in the saddle, horse-side stepping. A solid crack of steel on wood cut the air. Elias had driven the axe blade deep into an upright log. "She stays," Elias said, voice sharp as the wind. "And if anyone thinks to use court or gossip to take this place from me, they'll stand right here and tell me to my face." The laughter from the riders died. Two exchanged uneasy glances. One shifted as if ready to leave. Harlan's jaw worked. He yanked his rez, wheeling his horse and spraying slush against the fence. Without another word, he rode toward the road, the others following. The drum of hooves faded into the trees. Linda stood where she was, heart pounding, the sheet forgotten. Cold touched her skin, but inside was a steady heat. Elias crossed the yard. His voice was low. carrying the warmth of something almost like a smile. "You didn't have to say all that." Linda met his gaze, breath still fast. "Yes, I did. I'm not running this time." The dawn came soft and pale, spilling over the hills in a muted gold that touched the frost on the fence rails. Linda was sweeping the kitchen floor when she heard the steady tread of boots behind her. She turned to see Alias standing in the doorway. Something folded in his hands. He stepped forward, holding it out. The fabric was worn but clean, a faded cotton apron, its ties softened by years of use. "It belonged to Mary," he said quietly. "She wore it every day until—" Well, he paused, his gaze steady on hers. "I don't have a ring to give you, but I've got land, I've got my children, and I've got the faith that you're the piece we've been missing." The room seemed still around them, the only sound the faint ticking of the stove. Linda looked down at the apron, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. The fabric was warm from where he had held it, and the weight of the gesture settled deep in her chest. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop it, tears welled in her eyes. Yet alongside, the ache was a smile she could not hold back, a smile born from the slow, steady knowing that this moment was not a rescue nor an arrangement, but a choice they were both making. She nodded once, her voice soft but sure. "Then I'll wear it." From the doorway of the children's room, Annie and Tommy appeared, drawn by the stillness. They patted over, their faces bright with curiosity. Annie reached out to touch the apron in Linda's hands. "Does this mean you're staying?" Linda knelt so she was eye level with them. "It means," she said, her voice catching, "that I'm part of this family now." Annie's eyes shone. She threw her arms around Linda's neck, pressing her face into her shoulder. "Now you're our mama," she whispered, her words warm against Linda's ear. Ami wrapped his small arms around both of them, and for a moment the world outside, its judgments, its whispers, felt impossibly far away. Elias stood a step back, his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching them with the kind of quiet pride that spoke louder than any vow. Later that morning, after the children had gone out to feed the hens, Linda stepped onto the porch. The air carried the scent of thawing earth, and the last of the snow clung stubbornly to the shaded corners of the yard. In her hands, she held two small wooden birds, one carved by Elias, the other by Annie and Tommy, together. She tied a length of twine through each and hung them from a nail on the porch beam, where they swayed gently in the breeze. Their wings were still rough, the grain of the wood showing through. But they caught the light like they had been waiting for this place all along. Linda stood there for a long while, the morning sun warming her face. She could hear the children's laughter from the yard, the soft cluck of hens, the rhythmic sound of Ilya splitting wood in the distance. The snow would be gone soon, replaced by green shoots and muddy boots, and with it the long winter she had carried inside herself seemed finally ready to melt. She looked out over the road that wound toward town, then back at the small, solid house behind her. This was where her steps had led, not to the life she had expected, but to the one she had been meant to find. Her fingers brushed over the apron's fabric tied now around her waist. "Home," she whispered to herself. And in the quiet of that porch, beneath the sway of the two wooden birds, she knew with certainty that this was where her heart belonged. And that's the tale of how Linda Whitford, left at a lonely rail station, found not just shelter, but a family and a place to belong. In the harsh winds of the Dakota Territory, she learned that love doesn't always arrive with flowers or fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet deeds, shared burdens, and the steady promise of staying. If you felt the chill of the winter storm and the warmth of that porch fire, There are more stories like this waiting for you. Subscribe to Legends of the Wild West stories for more heartfelt romances, untold frontier dramas, and moments that prove love can bloom even in the most rugged of lands. Her bullets missed, but hearts didn't.